just make sure that it's when it will be played that you'll
that I will be
introduce yourself. But again, thank you very much all for coming for this open lecture by Dr. Kolja Rauber from Leuven University. Kolja will talk about the topics concerning contemporary EU foreign policy, liberal order, and the position of the EU. It fits very well into the curriculum of those of you who are participating either in the EU foreign security policy course or the course with Senator Click, which are very sort of combined topics. We will be live streamed and recorded. This lecture is sponsored by Jean Monnet Network, EU across the globe. Kolja is one of the major coordinators on behalf of our sort of main coordinating institution, Leuven. But there is more into the network, so please follow the link and follow closely announcements, because we will also be announcing other events within this network that might be of interest to you. So thank you very much. Kolja, the floor is yours. The click is yours, or is it already recorded?
I have no idea. I hope it is, but we also need to see the PowerPoints for the students, if that's possible. Because normally it's on, but I don't know what you know. Right.
It is on.
It is recording. Good. And you see the PowerPoint?
No.
No, I think he misunderstood, to be honest. Because I don't...
Can I just stop? Oh. Okay, let's try
he's here. He's still
okay,
down the corridor. So let me start. Okay, we are online. That's fine, and it's a great pleasure for all of us to be here, including, of course, myself. It's a great pleasure to receive the invitation by Professor Gura and the team of Jagiellonian University. I am myself based at the University of Leuven. The University of Leuven is the organizer of a Jean Monnet network called EU Cross, and in the context of that network, does it still work?
It doesn't follow the time, it's for the past. I don't know how it's...
Okay. So perhaps you should... It's for the past.
Yeah, like, it doesn't record the moment.
But...
There's some left in time, just 20 seconds or something, that's fine. More?
Which should be fine. It's just a matter of live streaming it and recording it. Now, what is important is when we look at the project EU Cross, we are talking about the European Union at the crossroads of global order. I will come back to the actual project in a second, and actually, especially at the end of the lecture. But it is very important to keep in mind that in the project we are looking into the liberal order, we are looking into what are the current features of the crisis of the liberal order, and what I am myself, but also colleagues in the project, including our team from Jagiellonian University, what they are interested in is how does the EU actually respond to the challenges of the global order. So, that being said, it is important to look into how can the European Union, on the one hand, make sense of what is happening and how does it react. And in order to cover this topic, and I hope you see the slides coming up relatively soon, I decided to basically talk today about the European Union as a global governor and the looming crisis of the international liberal order. So what I will do with you is to talk about globalization. I will talk about globalism. I will talk about what actually is a global governor, in order to do then a next step and talk about what is the liberal order and the contestation of the liberal order as we see it today. Now, it is, thank you very much, it is, in that sense, I think, quite a timely topic, and I hope that here at this very occasion we can, over the next 1.5 hours, look into this particular topic. The European Union as a global governor and the looming crisis of the international order needs, let's say, some guidance. And I, as I said before, want to talk about globalism, global governance, and the liberal order. I want to talk about the EU in global governance, the response of the EU as a global governor, but also the challenges that the EU faces. And then I would like to look into the options and responses that came from the EU, because the EU is obviously quite aware that there is something wrong with the liberal international order. And then I want to reflect briefly at the end also upon the project that we are currently doing, the EU Cross project, and how it could potentially bring up some new thinking about how the EU should act towards this looming crisis of the international order. Now, let us start from some basics, okay? And the basics are, I would say, to talk about what we have, why we have it, and how the EU relates to it, okay? And in that sense, it is, I think, important a little bit to start with the, let's say, alphabet of global governance. And you can only talk about global governance if you understand what globalization is. Globalization is a very important aspect of our daily life. It has arguably been with us for centuries, some people say, and others say, well, it has only emerged in the late 20th century, and now what we witness is actually the amplified globalization through technological advances, etc., etc. That actually makes us coming closer to each other wherever we are in the world, if you only think about how easily we can communicate over the various tools which are at our disposal when it comes to social media, for example. And here, I think it is important to understand that actually globalization can be seen as a buzzword, and that globalization can refer to the shrinkage of distance on a large scale. It can be contrasted with localization, nationalization, or regionalization. That is basically what globalization in a nutshell entails. However, Keohane and I have also argued that actually for research purposes, for us reflecting upon what we are actually witnessing, globalism is the better term, because it does not necessarily point into a certain direction. It is very open to either being decreasing or increasing as a condition of societies that are increasingly or decreasingly integrated. So globalization and deglobalization refer to the increase or decline of globalism. Now, that first point is, I think, quite important because it sets the tone. It sets the tone of why we are actually having a thing called global governance. And let us have a look. So, arguably, patterns of globalization, the shrinking and of globalism, are making us think about working towards global solutions. And you can say here a definition, very basic definition of McGrew, saying it is about regulating trans-border problems, it's political coordination among governments, it's formal and informal structures such as international organizations and networks. It's about articulating common purposes and collectively agreed goals, decision-making, and implementation of global or transnational rules. All of this is basically related to coming up with global solutions and arriving at what McGrew calls a global governance complex. Now, does it answer the question why we need it? No, probably not, right? Because what it does at the moment is simply a description. It's a description, a feature of the global governance complex. But the question is, why do we need it? Do you have an idea why we actually would need to come up with a global governance complex? Why in times of globalization, it is important to have a global governance complex in place? Yes?
Because we have some kind of very global, complex problems like climate change, international terrorism, trade supplies, something like that.
Exactly, right? And these problems, these threats, sometimes these are security threats, sometimes these are threats to our stability, sometimes they are threats to sustainability of what we're doing. These threats will only be able to be tackled if we are trying to come up with global, common solutions. It is simply not enough, because the threats or the problems are transported, to work on them bit by bit or state by state, society by society. We need actually a global response. We need to tackle the actual causes, a global idea of what the problem is and what potentially could be our solutions, right? Take the case of migration. It's all fine and fair that we have in the European context now the idea that we can tackle migration flows by having camps at the border, at the outer border of Africa, in northern Africa, whether we like it or not. But it's not really a contribution to the global governance complex. It may be a solution regionally, but it's not really looking into this in a more global fashion. So we also have to situate what our answers are and whether they are actually related to a proper global governance complex. So one important differentiation is also that when we talk about global governance, that we understand it's not global government. It's not global government. It is not a single world order. It is not top-down hierarchical. It is not a top-down hierarchical structure of authority. That is basically the negative definition of Karnst and Minks when they talk about global governance. What they refer to is more of a very heterogeneous way of actually dealing with global problems in various settings, be it informal or formal settings, involving governments, but not necessarily only involving governments. It can also be transnational actors or transnational organizations, right? And in that sense, global governance, Weiss and Wilkinson argue, is different from international organization. Scale-wise, global governance refers to the totality of the ways, formal and informal, in which the world is governed. Yes, you have a question.
Why we talk of global governance for issues that are identified as problem conceptually that concern principally the so-called Western world?
Sorry, I didn't understand the last part of the question.
Why we talk about a global governance for issues that are identified as problems concerning primarily the so-called Western world?
Well, that's basically an assumption, right? That we are tackling global governance issues and that these global governance issues are predominantly constructed by the Western world, or that they would be solved in benefit of the Western world. If you look into the literature, you will probably see a lot of critical analysis that actually will also say that Western actors are quite dominant, even in the various global governance formations. But there would be others who actually claim that global governance is also an exercise to actually bring in other actors beyond the Western world and actually to find solutions beyond the concerns and interests of the Western world. If you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, in the context of the United Nations, you will see that these goals are definitely trying to address issues and problems that are also related to, for example, the so-called developing world. So it's important to have that clearly distinct, to actually look into why is a global governance complex on a certain topic made, which kind of solutions does it try to find, but also who benefits from the solutions of the global governance complex. I would like to also ask you one more question, because it's essential in the context of our lecture today. In which regard would global governance be different from international organizations? I already mentioned it, but I just would like to be very clear that everybody understood that. Why would global governance be different from international organizations? Who are the actors represented in an international organization, and which other actors are actually involved in global governance? Yes, please.
Well, international organizations kind of institutionalize relations between states, right? International relations.
Yeah.
Whereas, according to this definition, global governance is much broader and
right.
goes about any form of power.
Yeah, this is very important that you understand that actually global governance goes way beyond our understanding of international organizations. International organizations are based on states, on member states. So we are dealing in the realm of intergovernmental relations, right? Whereas when we look at global governance, we have to widen the spectrum of actors. There can be coalitions of actors that are actually transnational in nature, that are not necessarily transgovernmental, but transnational in nature, and that is very important to understand. Now, when we come to the yes, now it works. When we come to the international liberal order, however, we start predominantly from the assumption that the order is made of states. So there is a difference here between global governance and the liberal order. At the same time, I would argue that global governance is actually very much contributing to the liberal order, and that also the liberal order informs global governance. Now, what are the different elements of the liberal order? The liberal order, which we will later talk about in terms of how it is contested. According to Alcaro, in the latest book on how the EU actually responds to global order, he identifies 5 elements that very much are linked to the liberal order. Internationalism, institutionalism, interdependence and transnationalism, regional cooperation, human rights and democracy. And in fact, these are underlying elements, he argues, of the international liberal order. Let's just briefly have a look at these elements. What can we possibly understand as internationalism? Yes?
Maybe again that the world is divided into nation states, and that the authority to negotiate internationally or globally between these people is is carried by the state or the political representatives of these nations.
Okay. I would even go a step further. I think as a starting point, this is very good. I would even go a step further and add one element to it. Yes, we're talking about states. Yes, we are talking about the representation of states. But we are also talking about an implicit dynamic that brings these states to cooperation on the international level, right? So the international cooperation of states is actually implicit in the notion of internationalism. There is a wonderful book by a historian called Mark Martsover. Has anybody heard of the book? It's called Governing the Globe. You may want to have a look at it. It's very, very interesting because you can see how the idea of internationalism, of the international, needed to be developed in the 19th and then actually only in the 20th century to finally create the institutions which we then got and that are very much at the heart of cooperation of states after the Second World War, mainly the United Nations and its apparatus. Before the Second World War, we had international organizations seemingly, but we didn't necessarily have a global reach of international organizations. Now, you also have institutionalism as one of the elements in the liberal order. Institutionalism. What do we mean by institutionalism? We mean international rules, right? This morning in our debate, we heard about the rules-based order. Institutions provide us with rules of the game, with procedures that are followed up, that gives us actually security about knowing what and how we are going to cooperate and deal with each other in international affairs. If these rules break away, it will be less easy to actually cooperate and achieve common understandings, let alone problem solving in the long run. We have interdependence and transnationalism according to Alcaro. We mentioned interdependence this morning as well. What is interdependence after all? Yes.
We can name it this economical interdependence because all resources are dispersed across the world, so countries should trade with each other.
Trade, right, is one element of interdependence. It's actually the exchange and interaction across borders. And it may not necessarily be the case that it's always and only about states. But as I mentioned here, transnationalism, it can also be other actors that actually exchange across borders and that facilitate a certain structure, be it a structure of economic relations, be it a structure of personal relations, that are implicit in the liberal order, because what the liberal order facilitates in the end is the exchange and the ongoing and increasing exchange of these transnational interactions. So in that regard, at the heart of the liberal order that we have seen up until today, and that is now put in question, is the idea of liberalization, of trade liberalization. And how does it come about? How do you have trade liberalization? When we talk about trade liberalization, what needs to be in place in order to facilitate trade liberalization? Yes?
International agreements.
Exactly. But agreements on what?
Well, on erasing or reducing all the limits and barriers that can reduce trades between states or...
Right. We want to bring down the tariffs, right? We normally live in a world of tariffs. That means that actually products around the world are treated very unequally. And that brings us then to the function of the liberal order to actually overcome a world of tariffs and to actually liberalize so that transnational interactions such as that of companies, but you can also look into other tariffs and borders, such as, for example, in the European Union, in a regional context, the free movement of goods and persons and capital. Yeah? So that is very much at the heart of the liberal order. I mentioned the European Union because regional cooperation and integration is another aspect of the liberal order. The liberal order facilitates that cooperation in order to achieve the other elements of the order. Internationalism, institutionalism, interdependence. And with it also comes the idea that actually there is a universal understanding of what is a human right. And that, in the long run, according to Alcaro, the participation in a community and the political affairs of a community also leads individuals and societies to live under the framework of democracy. Now, the latter, to be honest, I would find very difficult to accept as a universal objective. It has been argued that there may be in some of the resolutions of the United Nations an implicit right to democracy, but what we see in the universal human rights is actually much more of a notion of the individual rights, political rights, that not necessarily are related to democracy. So this is a very contested question, whether there is a right to democracy in the liberal order. But at the same time, we can, of course, argue that from the perspective of an ideal liberal order, democracy will certainly be a part of it. Now, related to that liberal order is the governance, which is informed by the values of liberal order, and at the same time, the values of the liberal order are dependent on the support by the domestic constituents of the liberal order. So it becomes very important to look into who is actually domestically supporting the liberal order and who is not. And that is, of course, a question of contestation. So if there is actually a contestation of the governance structures and of the values, we very much see the liberal order under contestation. Yeah? So be very clear, when you have a domestic setting within which a government argues that elements of the liberal order need to be overcome, we have to question whether this is domestically driven. As researchers, we have to think about where is this attitude coming from? Why is that government actually now putting the liberal question, the liberal order in question? So what would be your hunch? What would you think? Why is Donald Trump currently proposing not only to leave the climate change governance complex? Why is he leaving the Human Rights Council? Why is he leaving the nuclear deal with Iran? Why has he pulled out of UNESCO? Right? Why is that? Where is that coming from? The answer is actually here, on this slide. He may see that there is less support from amongst his voters. And he plays that card to please his voters and to actually show that the United States can no longer support the activities of the liberal order because the electorate, at least the majority, according to his view, is no longer supportive of it. So we have to understand where the contestation of the liberal order is coming from. You can turn it around as well and say, you know, he is actually putting in question the governance structure. He is putting in question certain elements of the governance structure of the liberal order when he pulls out of institutions like the Human Rights Council. So we see the effect, we see the contestation of the governance structure, and we can relate it potentially back to the domestic setting. At the same time, it can also be that the domestic setting is very much informed by the activities of the governance structure and the values of the liberal order. One of the... Yes, please.
So it would be the really undermining regional cooperation. Well, for example, when Trump wanted to agree only with Angela Merkel, and she reminded him that he had to talk with the European Union. Really, he only wants to request the regional cooperation and all the consequences it has on the economic field. That is not, and the US are not longer the main actor in economic development or economic trade. European Union and its integration could be an enemy. So, wanted to undermine the tendencies. Maybe also we wanted to destroy this picture of the liberal order.
See, I think that in a way, coming from the attitude that everything needs to be related back to the national interest, stands often in the way of regional cooperation. You need to have at least some leeway for cooperation. If you simply say, this is my national interest, full stop, you will not have a very easy time finding partners for cooperation. And I have the feeling that actually the European Union is quite a suspicious organization because it is full of compromise. And it is full of compromises of national interests. National interests are represented, but they are obviously compromised because it needs to be driven by a long-term European perspective. And I think that part of the problem between the European Union and Donald Trump is related to the fact that he actually finds regional cooperation in itself very suspicious because it has the potential of actually undermining the national sovereignty and interest, rather than seeing it as an opportunity for states to actually achieve policies and policy solutions that otherwise could not be achieved. And then at the same time, we also have to understand that the European Union is a very big power. And it's very, very dangerous for the international interest of the United States if you want to look at it through the perspective of Donald Trump. Because for him, there is only something to be lost but not gained when opening markets for European products. And actually it is much more about China rather than the European Union. So I think these two perspectives come together. Is that more or less clear? The elements of the liberal order and how contestation could potentially contribute to undermining the liberal order. Obviously, we also have to accept that there are international actors in the world which have not very often been willing to subscribe to the liberal order at all. And we have to keep an eye on them as well. And then there are certain actors in the world which will find certain elements of the international order very appealing, but others not. And we have to also think about where this is coming from. For example, China. If you look at China, which elements of this international order would China be very willing to subscribe to, and which other elements would it rather be hesitant to subscribe to? You know, speak out of a gut feeling. What does your belly tell you?
Surely China don't support human rights and democracy.
Well, are you sure? Are you sure? You know, people in China get incredibly rich. People in China have fortunes, at least some of them. So there is a demand for rights in China.
Also, okay, we can talk about the concept of democracy, but as also Habermas wrote a few years ago, the human rights in China are related to the liberalization of the markets. So, when I say China, obviously I mean the head of the states, not the people.
Right.
But yeah, the issue concerning the relationship between the human rights and the liberal market and the growth of the salaries of the Chinese is a new issue.
In any way, we will probably see the Chinese government not being very willing to grant, for example, human rights, especially political human rights, such as, for example, the right to free speech, which could, in the long run, also result in the questioning of the current Chinese regime. So I think we have to be a little bit careful in which human rights we are actually talking about and who would contest which human rights. But in general, I would fully agree with you. This is probably the element that an actor like China would have most problems with subscribing to. Whereas if you look at, for example, its initiative in the context of trade, China is very much interested as a growing power, as a potential new superpower, as the number one in trade, to look at the international order through the lens of internationalization, but also institutionalization. So China has an interest, an increasing interest, also in the context of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to actually have rules in place that will allow it to sustain its progress and its trade with the outside world. The crisis of the liberal order can, of course, be very much related to the rise of nationalism, more specifically the rise of unilateralism. We've been seeing a lot of undermining activities of the liberal international order, in the sense that states like the United States start doing things unilaterally. It's not only Trump, it's also been the case with other administrations of the United States, that from time to time there were efforts to actually undermine the rules which were agreed upon. I remind you of the war towards Iraq, for example. And at the same time, we also today need to understand that a state like the United States, which was basically the hegemon of the liberal international order, supporting the order, but also having the power to actually forcefully intervene, that this hegemonic state is having is increasingly withdrawing its support from the order. And then we have to talk about alternative global orders and conceptions of global order. We've seen, for example, the BRICS. You all know what the BRICS are. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And we have seen alternative forms of the global multilateral order emerging around the concepts of the BRICS. I'm only referring to the investment bank, for example, which has been quite successful in attracting attention. And also China itself has, for example, proposed initiatives such as the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the AIIB, as an alternative multilateral banking form to actually complement development efforts. Complementary and potentially also competitive orders that emerge next to the liberal order of the United Nations, but also the Bretton Woods institutions, including the World Bank and the IMF. Now, in the European context, I think we also have to understand that there is a fall of, let's call it, the pan-European order. What do I mean by the pan-European order? It seemed, and Francis Fukuyama was referring to it, obviously, in his book, The End of History, that after 1989, 1990, we would all integrate in Europe into a larger pan-European order, right? There was the European Union to start with. But we also have other European organizations and international organizations, such as the Council of Europe, such as exactly, the OSCE, right? By the way, with a very interesting department situated here in Warsaw, in Poland, on democracy and human rights. And it is very important to keep in mind that that pan-European order was quite powerful in, let's say, organizing Europe, ordering Europe, along the lines, more or less, of the liberal international order, with human rights, with democracy at its heart, with institutions at play, not always supranational, obviously, not always the way how the European Union would function, but very much driven by the idea of cooperation. Now, that pan-European order is arguably on its way down. The Council of Europe is no longer the Council of Europe which we've seen in the 1990s. The OSCE has more problems than actually solutions to many of the conflicts that it is actually witnessing, such as the conflict in Ukraine. And we have to honestly question who is actually sustaining that order and who is having which interest. But arguably, some of the members of that order are no longer contributing to this order in order to sustain a liberal European order. But there is something alternative emerging. And that alternative is putting stress on the European project. And by the European project, I mean the liberal European project, which we saw emerging in the 1990s. In the European Union, because contestation is not necessarily only contestation, obviously, of Russia, Turkey, or you could also look into some other states in Eastern Europe. In fact, we also have in the European Union problems with contestation, and I would say this has very much to do with the fall of European solidarity. The fact that actually member states, but also people at Europe, don't put the European cause first, but rather their national interests. And that actually brings about a lot of the contestation of how legitimate, I was talking about that earlier today, how legitimate the European Union is. If you only look at the migration crisis, you will see, I think, how few solidarity there is. So no solidarity, hardly any solidarity seemingly with migrants, and also no solidarity with other European countries and member states. So that is not necessarily a good and useful issue when it comes to sustaining the liberal order, its rules, its drive towards more internationalization, towards more institutions in the European context. And then finally, I think what we also see is the rise and fall and rise of European borders. Again, the migration crisis has shown us this, but in the European Union, we were very proud of actually bringing down borders, all kinds of borders, tariff borders, physical borders, so that people could pass the borders. And this time seems to have come, at least in some of the member states, to an end. And we have to ask ourselves why that is and why people believe in borders rather than bringing down borders between countries and territories. Why is it that actually liberalization is no longer at the heart of what people want, but why is it rather their security, their territorialization, their withdrawing from that liberal order? So the question is, whether we actually see multiple orders on the horizon, whether the contestation of the liberal order brings about the rise of multiple orders, and what are the variations of order, both thematically but also regionally, geographically. And we have to have a good eye on that, because it seemed that the liberal order was actually quite well represented, both on a global level but also on a regional level, that we could actually see the liberal order somehow represented in the various international institutions which we saw evolving. And yet we have to take into account contestation and how it brings about variations of that order through contestation. So the question is basically towards which order? Are there questions on this? Yes, Mark.
Yeah. Is this a natural consequence of the multipolar world, in a way, so that more poles you have, more orders they're trying to create, in a way? So, in a way, is that is this a message that you're trying to convey to us also, is that liberal order, in a way, sort of understood as a global one, is a function of a hegemonic system, in a way, while the multiple orders is a consequence of a multipolar world?
Well, at least a lot of actors are and have been arguing that the international liberal order has been a Western concept, right, from the beginning. And that human rights were actually not that universal, for example, right? So we had always these arguments. And you could say, okay, it needed the United States to actually make sure that everybody in the end was accepting it, but we should also keep in mind that, and I don't need to remind you, in fact, that we have been living in a world which was actually contesting that liberal order, right, until 1989. So we had, during the time of the Cold War, actually, the contestation about which order to follow. In the post-1989 1990 developments, I would indeed say there is a multipolarity emerging. But in that multipolarity, for a long time, it was kind of implicit that the liberal order would be sustainable and that it would be, in the end, the order that everybody would follow. And we did a lot of efforts to do that in many respects. And I was giving you the example of the various organizations here in Europe, which I think are a good example of that. Indeed, when the hegemon is no longer a hegemon, or when it actually is in decline, the question is what happens, right? Who is going to actually step in? And I think you're right. We could argue that this has to do with the decline of the United States, but also, of course, the advance of new powers, or, as we mentioned this morning, the imagination of some sort of power, right? Some major powers still think they can be very much superpowers and contest the order on the basis of that belief. Does anybody know the picture here? It's Paul Klee, okay? That's the starting point. It's Paul Klee picture. Does anybody know the name of that picture? It's probably not. It's called Polyphony. Do you know what polyphony is?
It's a combination of sounds.
Sorry?
It's a combination of sounds.
It's a combination of sounds, right? It's a combination of sounds. And the funny thing about polyphony is that you have, so to speak, different tunes on different levels that play together. And the question a little bit is whether we accept that. Whether we accept that everybody is playing his own tune. And it may actually look, in the end, look quite orderly. Renaissance music has been very much composed along the lines of polyphony. Now, a lot of my colleagues don't like it when I talk about this that way, because it means that we have to accept that some of our also rather universal values may actually be, well, no longer be sung by others, but that there is a different tune emerging. But I think it's a quite accurate description of what we may face, or what we are currently already facing. Not only on the level of order, perhaps it makes even more sense on the level of actors, where we can actually see that different actors play very different tunes. And sometimes we come together, and actually it makes a lot of sense together, such as in the European Union. Also, sometimes still in the United Nations. And yet, we also have to understand that sometimes things look a little bit more messy than here in this beautiful picture. I think this is a little bit the message that I want to convey to you, that actually in that context, the EU needs to find its place, needs to make sense of what goes on, needs to be able to relate to the orders, to the shrinking orders, to the re-established orders, or perhaps to the continuation of order. Yes?
Are the new powers thinking about the values or the justification of a new kind of order, international order, For example, we are talking about liberal order, and liberal order as deeply and old roots, even from the end of the Middle Ages. But when it comes to the question, what kind of new order, the most thing I hear here is, well, liberal order is fading, but what are the new main protagonists thinking about the justification of the new one?
As I already mentioned, I think the BRICS are a good case to study, or perhaps parts of the BRICS, to see how they try to actually establish alternative multilateral settings. Huh? And you can look into the BRICS Investment Bank. You can also look into the more at first unilaterally driven idea of an Asian infrastructure and investment bank by China, which I think was joined, don't get me right on the numbers, by 15 member states of the European Union, even more. So you see there is an alternative order emerging, at least along certain, let's say, segments, policy segments, yeah? Such as development and infrastructure. I think if I look at certain actors, and we would have to study it in greater detail, I have the feeling that, for example, China as an actor is wise enough not to actually create necessarily new international organizations, or, let's say, multi-topical organizations. What I think we can rather witness, and I don't know whether you followed it, is a much more functional approach of changing cooperation, such as cooperation with the developing world, the huge investments of China and Africa, for example, or the Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically the more northern, let's say, if you look at it, it stretches basically along the whole northern hemisphere of our planet, except for the United States and Canada. So these are initiatives that can potentially bring new order, that are, however, driven by a very functional approach, which would say rather that the form follows the function. We'll see what the form is in the end. We first do it. We have an idea. We want to sell our products. We want to work on economic relations. We want to actually expose the fact that we are an economic superpower. And then we see what emerges. I don't think there is necessarily this idea of, what federalists call function follows form. I think it's more the other way around that we are witnessing. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could continue a little more about these variations of order. For example, what exactly you mean with the thematic variations? Is it like, as you mentioned now, with maybe on development cooperation something else than on military cooperation?
No, it's very basic. It's no huge theoretical thinking. I think there's a new order emerging when the US pulls out. You cannot look at it the same way as if the US was in. So we have thematic variations, for example, in climate governance. And in climate governance, we now have a new order, which is very much an order where the US has withdrawn or is basically on its way out, and where we have to see who comes in next. I mean, who will be... China has happily agreed to be the new hegemon of that order. Well, we'll see whether that will play out. So it's no fancy theory behind it. It's more of a very, pragmatic way of looking at it, saying there is no liberal international order as such, perhaps, any longer, but we rather have to look into the variations of topics depending on the membership and on the contributions of certain actors to it. And geographically the same, right? We thought that actually the liberal order would span all the way to Siberia, when we were thinking about the Council of Europe. But there is a variation now. even in the context of the Council of Europe. So that is basically also what I mean by geographical variation.
But does that mean that there's no that we see a decline also not just of the liberal international order, but of global order in general, because countries are chipping off and because there's alternative arrangements for different regions?
See, I'm going to take a very easy way out, because I told you a lot about global governance. I think we will see much more global governance. I think we will see much less, so to speak, liberal order, but much more global governance, where people, states, organizations come together to deal with the problems, and then we see who is on board. And if we are lucky, we will have a large number of actors coming together. And when we are rather unlucky or then this needs to be done in a limited setting. Yes.
Yeah. So a few kind of comments, questions to you, or actually questions for your reflection on that one, because recently in the literature, and I think we've been together at the meeting when we discussed the climate change regime, and there was this idea from scholars that are doing a lot of empirical work there, saying that one thing that really closes us in a kind of way of thinking about it is that it must be global.
Yeah.
Right? So this is like the global panic when the Trump in the Rose Garden is announcing he's withdrawing, because we think in order to be successful, it must be global. It must be everybody. And then scholars that are doing this research, they say, well, try to think out of the box and think, if we would have functional interlocked regimes, this might actually produce even better outcome than waiting for everybody agreeing on everything, which is possibly not coming close, or in the close future, right? So that's one thing, is like, also in your reflection, how much can we go this direction? And how much you think this is a possibility, and how much threat there is in this kind of thinking that we should abandon global solutions, right? In a way, saying, okay, let China do their job, because they have the same results, because everybody is afraid of what's going to happen when we are not going to do anything about it. So that's a one comment, sort of question to you. And the second one is coming from a reflection and actually empirical, because, this is something that a lot of scholars are trying to empirically grasp, because a lot what we talk is normative in a way, right? We think this might be this way, but there is sort of only now some more empirical research there. So there was some research which was looking into many countries that are not necessarily Western sort of champions of the order, when they were asking them, and that was predominantly foreign policy allies, when they were asking them, okay, so when it comes to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, how do you assess it? Is it something that you trust as an institution? And they were asking us about the Bretton Woods institutions, FACCC, and other possible sort of global governance hubs. And interestingly, the major thing that is really contested is not a fundamental norm on which those organizations are operating, but rather the practical norms. The discrimination and the practical everyday working in the Bretton Woods systems, not the idea that this should be abolished, right? From the perspective of Brazil, for instance. And this is another issue. What's contested in this liberal order? Is it the fundamental norms, or are these, functioning principles, right? Antti Wiener with her sort of ideas. And this is also something, if it's not a fundamental norm, you mentioned China and democracy, which I think is a very interesting thing, because we see that coming, right? That sort of, they not necessarily fully contest the notion as such, but they contest predominantly operational norms. This is interesting, because this opens this entire debate into yet another dimension. Maybe this is not the end of this international order, but it is a liberal international order. Maybe it is the end of how it was functioning, rather than on which norms or fundamental values it is anchored. I'm just trying to put a stick into the wheel to start the debate on this.
Yeah, I think you're fully right. I think it's very important to do more empirical research on it. First of all, more empirical research on the actual level of contestation, what is contested, but also how coherent is the contestation actually, right? Do we see the same contestation of international norms, be it the substantial norms or the more procedural norms, on a local level, domestic level, compared to a regional level and international level? We have a research project on that in Leuven, which is called connectivity, so not reconnect but connectivity, and we are studying basically the cases of China, Japan, India, Russia, Brazil, and Egypt, and the United States. And we're looking into to which degree these actors are actually contesting international norms and for which reasons. And do they do that in a coherent manner? And the idea is really to get more information about what is actually at the heart of the claim that these actors make. And so very much in line with what you just said. But at the same time, the question is also, does it always mean that the doors for cooperation are closed? So does contestation necessarily equal non-cooperation? And I think that is one of the big questions in the long run. How much room there will remain for cooperation, and in which forms and configurations. So I think there will be a recalibration of what we call the liberal international order, but the question is, how will it look like? So I was mentioning the global governance formats because this is, I think, the most drastical way of actually looking at it, that at certain points we do not need states at all, right? If they don't do it, then we just ask the cities to do it, right? And we see that development in the United States already, where the cities are now coming in and say, well, we are implementing it. May not be our federal government, but we are doing it. And so it may be other actors, right? And we have to see how this will look like. Okay, as the EU is our topic, I would like to basically jump to the next slide. How much time do we still have?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. That is not enough. Anyway, I will be quick. So basically, the question is why bother? Okay, we have to. The question is, why should we bother about the EU? If you take the perspective of realists, we don't have to bother at all about the European Union. And at the same time, if you take the perspective of for example, constructivists or other scholars, we do actually have to take it into account because it produces a lot of output, and it follows also certain policy directions, such as norms, interests. So we have to be aware of this. Now, I wanted to quickly share with you what a global governor is, because I think that one way looking at the European Union that matters, and that has not been done too often, is actually to look at the European Union not only as an actor in global governance, which is always very vague, right? What do actors actually do? They are there, but what happens? A global governor is much more concrete in the sense that, according to Avant, Finmore, and Sell, they impact on agenda setting, negotiations, decision-making, implementation, monitoring, and enforcement. So basically the whole policy cycle, right? The whole policy cycle, that is what a global governor does. And impacts on global governance through these various moments in the policy cycle. And we also have to understand that the European Union is interested in it. Why? Why should it be interested in it? Well, because more and more issues are dealt with or are decided upon on the EU level, and in order to successfully fulfill its tasks, the EU needs to be visible and present, and the visibility and presence of the EU does not only increase if it is also represented internationally and if it can speak for the EU. So, that brings us to the idea that actually the European Union is very much interested in actually being out there because it has a lot of competences and it has to have a representation also globally, because a lot of these issues that it's dealing with are actually having an external component. Now, as we heard already time and again, the EU is not alone. It's very much based also in the community that it is on its member states. So when you look at the EU, there are a couple of challenges, right? And these challenges are very much related to the fact that we have different policies, but related to the member states. We then have EU external policies, which are very much related to domains where the EU has a level of competence which we may call supranational. So we are here already in a domain where it is not only dependent on member states, but also very much on new forms of decision-making, such as qualified decision-making, the role of the Commission, etc. And we also have, let's say, the European external policies, where we have to look into how the EU policies come together with the member states' policies. And actually, the common foreign and security policy is a very good example of that, where actually we can only make sense of what the EU is doing if we also look into what the member states are doing. And finally then, we have another challenge, and that is the European cooperation in global governance. So the question how the EU and the member states actually cooperate with each other and coordinate their practices in the context of global governance. So this doesn't really make things easier. And as you also heard, it is also important to take note of the notion of coherence. And the coherence notion can come in either in a vertical fashion or in a horizontal fashion. Why is coherence so important? Coherence is so important in the European Union because it's very diverse. As the first quote here by Christopher Hill shows, the European foreign policy is stuck with a full measure of difference. So that is the problem. That's the fundamental problem of the European Union. It's a full measure of difference. How can you actually come to terms? How can you be a global governor if you need to coordinate all these 28 member states and on top of it the European Commission and the European Parliament and all of that in order to provide policy output that is actually accepted by EU citizens? Full measure of difference, full measure of problems, so to speak. And one of the answers of the European Union has been, well, let's do it through coherence. We try to coordinate between the member states and the EU, that's what we call vertical coherence, and we try to coordinate our policies amongst different institutions, the Commission, the Council, and also, to a certain degree, the European Parliament. So we bring everybody together in one way and in another way. And this is basically how it looks like, right? On a horizontal or policy-related coherence, you have CFSP, but there is not only CFSP, there are also other policy areas, and they need to be integrated into the approach of the global governance, so to speak, that the EU wants to be. Because not one of these issue areas can be looked at independently, and definitely not the common foreign and security policy. It only makes sense if you see it in conjunction with other policies, such as the European Neighbourhood Policy, ENP, development cooperation, internal policies, and also the whole spectrum of the so-called external financial instruments. So, another challenge is, also addressed it this morning, that the EU, in its way, in its attempt to become a global governor, is also seen very differently depending on different scholarly perspectives. And in the end, these scholarly perspectives also represent, of course, the different ways of how the European Union is looked at in reality. Yeah? And I only give you a couple of the power concepts that have been come up in the debate of what kind of power is the European Union actually. A civilian power, a normative power, cosmopolitan power, tragic power, transformative power, market power, patchwork power, structural power, liberal power, and what have you. So it goes on and on and on. And the EU needs to make sense of it, or should it rather not care? It seems that the EU, we mentioned it earlier, is very much attracted by the idea that it is a normative power. If you look at the language of the institutions, it very much speaks and often has spoken the language of normative power. But I will come to it because something is changing. The EU is having another problem, and that's the problem of legitimacy. I was mentioning that earlier. This is a figure or an illustration of an article that is forthcoming, where basically we argue it is these 6 dimensions of legitimacy that the EU has to continuously look at, especially in our domain here, European foreign policy, in order to be legitimate. It's very difficult. So you have 3 dimensions of input legitimacy or internal legitimacy, and you have 3 dimensions of external legitimacy, always around the concept of input, throughput, and output legitimacy. So we use the concept of Vivian Schmidt, the extension of the old concept of Fritz Scharf, so to speak, and then add to it the internal and external dimension. And if you want, I can share with you already this table, which will also be in the publication. So what we do then is we look into the legitimatory conditions and the legitimatory practice. And you see this is becoming very complicated. And probably nobody will ever look at this. But it's very important for us to understand that actually some of these dimensions do play a role. When you want to actually appear as a legitimate global actor or global governor, then you need to make sure that you are actually able to actually speak to at least some of these dimensions in order to be legitimate. So how does the EU respond to the liberal crisis with all that baggage of challenges, right? Referring to the difference challenge, referring to the coherence challenge, legitimacy challenge. Well, Federica Mogherini said 2014 during the hearing in the European Parliament, we are in times of crisis and difficult times. We have to shape a real foreign policy. We have to think big. We have to have a long-term vision, and we have to provide ownership. So, basically, this needed to be somehow related to the idea of what a global governor would have to do. And in fact, in the writing of Nathalie Tocci, who was one of the main, let's say, contributors to the European security strategy in 2016, she says, well, you know, we were more concerned with unilateralism versus effective multilateralism in 2008. And in 2016, it's more about the political rationale of multiple divides and the bureaucratic rationale of a joined-up union. So it's becoming, let's say, much more of a question of how to actually bring together different actors around the challenges that I mentioned before, rather than pointing at the difference between unilateralism and effective multilateralism that were at the heart of the EUSS in 2008, very much informed still by the Iraq War and the crisis of international order thereafter. And of course, there were a lot of scholars, including Renard and Bishop, Reich, but also Simon Duke, who were saying, you know, we have to make sense of that strategic order. We have to, of that strategy that the EU would be informed by in order to be a global governor in the long run. So here was the text in 2006, the EU Global Strategy, a twofold response to globalization and global governance. On the one hand, regional integration as a response to globalization and influences on global governments, and then also a commitment to the multilateral rules-based order. Activeness, norms and interest, but it's also very self-referential, and it focuses on effectiveness and coherence. I think what is most interesting in the EU global strategy is that actually it talks about the security of our union. It is very much driven by its own interests. It is actually talking about the resilience of others, but when you read the text, it's also a lot about the resilience at home. And it is about principled pragmatism. Does anybody know what principled pragmatism is?
Oxymoron.
It's an oxymoron, right? That's what I think, but why would you think it is an oxymoron? You can't have both.
Well, being pragmatic is giving way on the principles to some extent.
Right. And that is what critics have said. That actually you can't have both, right? You cannot eat meat and be a vegetarian at the same time. But the question is whether the European Union is actually taking these questions and also this strategy direction serious. And seemingly, according to some literature, the EU starts to change. And if we accept that principled pragmatism is about more flexibility in its approach to handle issues of global governance, not only to speak as a normative power, but also at times to look into your own interests, much more than in the past, then we may already see that some of that strategic thinking has actually also shown in the different actions of the European Union. So we have security and defense, building resilience and the integrated approach. We have the strengthening of the internal-external nexus, the strategizing in a complex world, and then finally public diplomacy as the key issues that the EU wants to tackle to actually promote the idea of its own and to become more strategic. One of the problems is that indeed the European Union may not have it both, but that actually we can identify in the long run what Mathieu Bonnet and myself call true modes of actually governance in the European Union. The one may still be very much driven by the idea of coherence, joining up different actors, but also very much looking into a coherent approach, for example, to human rights and its own values. That would allow, if you can read it at the end, to generate internal and external output legitimacy in view of credibility, right? If you're coherent and you do it again and again, you gain credibility. But according to the security strategy, that may no longer be the only mode. But we may rather see another mode emerging, which is much more about strategy, which is much more about actually putting your interests first, and actually in the end being interested again in output legitimacy, but asking especially for external recognition by setting a point and by making sure that your own interests are actually achieved. You may no longer be that credible because you jump from here to there, values and interests, but in the long run that may give you much more credibility and recognition. So with that being said, I think we have three elements now on the table. We have the liberal order, we have the contestation of the liberal order, and we have a European Union that tries to make sense of finding its way in the liberal order by strategizing itself, by choosing to actually be much more strategic, also perhaps at the expense of coherence and perhaps its own principles, to make sure that it can actually also address issues and answers which are arising in the new contestation of global order. In the EU Cross network, we try to look into the EU strategic reorientation. We try to look into what the EU is actually doing and how it is doing it, especially in various issue areas where we see, as I mentioned from time to time, where we see the contestation of actors such as the United States, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the question is, what are the EU's responses? Will it be adhering to its own principles? Will it actually be pushing the rules-based order? Or will it from time to time be more flexible? Will it be more actually adjusting to the new situation and actually contributing to it? Now, I want to leave you with three potential ways of modeling how the EU may actually in the long run be looked at in the context of the challenges that we face with regards to the liberal order. One way could be that we simply say we are what we are. We have our interests and we go for it. We look basically into centering the European Union, into making sure that the EU's interests and norms are achieved. We don't care about what others do. We are simply trying to find our way in the current situation that we are left with. An alternative way is an approach which is very much related to the writing of Calypso Nikolaidis, but also Stefan Kökeleder and others who have said, we have to be much more careful looking into what others are thinking. We have to be much more, in our way, addressing the resilience of others by actually looking into what they actually need and want, rather than presuming that our norms and interests are best for the world as well. And yet the third way may be to say, well, this is all fine, but once we have that tool to actually understand what others want and why they contest the liberal order, that we are actually trying to come to grips with the idea of how to actually embed that contestation in our own principles and interests. How can we actually be, in one way, understanding, in one way, perhaps also integrating the information we receive from others, taking it seriously, recognizing them for what they are, and at the same time reintegrate this into our own way of thinking, which very often is and will probably be, from the European Union's perspective, related to not only its own interests but also its norms and principles such as the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. To conclude very briefly, I think we've seen a crisis, and we are seeing it still, of the international order. The EU's attempt to be a global governor is very much related to the global strategy, and the question in the long run will be whether the measures that the European Union has taken, especially with regards to its approach to resilience and principled pragmatism, whether this is enough, or whether it needs to be more actually informed by what the contestation looks like and how this can be, so to speak, reintegrated into the EU's own positioning towards the global order. And with that, I would like to conclude.
Thank you very much, Julia. Yeah, we don't really have much time for questions unless there is something really very pressing. But we have the questions in the meantime, so I think that counts in a way. So thank you very much, Julia, for visiting us and delivering this lecture. Thank you all for participating, and see you soon at the classes, at the corridors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matt, can you help us to stop recording? Do you know how it works? Yeah, we need to close this one, I think. And close this down. Yeah, but we don't want to because can you just go and ask him? She asked me to let him know that he will come and I heard his phone streaming all the time. Yes. Yeah, I know. So if someone wants still to sign, please come here.
Dzień dobry, Panie Jerzy. Zakończyliśmy teraz lekcję, a ja nie wiem, jak się Okay, Pan Jerzy,
He's coming?
He's gonna come? Yeah. Yeah, please sign.
I have to go back to sleep.
Great, that sounds perfect. Yeah. So we'll talk next week then about that seminar, because we don't have it tomorrow. Yeah. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. But it's very quiet because we still on stream.
Yeah, I wonder where you switch it on.
There must be some sort of...
or he does it down there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's still going on.
Yeah, probably. We just leave the room and then...
Okay, Tina, the important thing is that we need a copy of it. So...